Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and coming up on today's programme, there's been a fourth night of protests in Los Angeles over US immigration policy. Rubber bullets and stun grenades are being used against protesters, and President Trump has ordered the deployment of US Marines to the city. Well, the governor of California says President Trump is acting like a dictator and described him as un-American. We'll be getting the very latest and asking how serious are the protests and how far are they spreading. Plus, we'll focus on the situation in Gaza. We'll be speaking to a doctor who's just back from her third mission to the enclave and asking for her take on some of the claims made by Israel. All of that to come on GNT. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the protests in the United States, and Los Angeles has seen a fourth night of protests and disturbances, this over US immigration policy. Well, last night the situation's reported to have been calmer, but previous days have seen rubber bullets being used against protesters. There have also been images of police officers being attacked. Well, President Trump has sent thousands more troops to Los Angeles. However, the unrest is reported to have spread to other parts of the United States. Meanwhile, we've heard from the governor of California, who described this move as fulfilling the deranged fantasies of a dictatorial president. That's what Gavin and Newsom said there, accusing President Trump of acting like a dictator. Well, this is the first time since 1965 that a president has sent National Guard troops to a US city without a governor's approval. Well, taking to Truth Social, President Trump said the alternative to doing this would be to let Los Angeles burn to the ground. Well, President Trump went even further. He even called for Governor Newsom's arrest.
He's an incompetent governor. Look at the job he's doing in California. He's destroying one of our great states. And if I didn't get involved, if we didn't bring the Guard in, and we would bring more in if we needed it, because we have to make sure there's going to be law and order. You had a disaster happening. And they now admit it was a disaster. I watched the chief yesterday, who's a good man, by the way, and he said, well, we're lucky we did this because they were overwhelmed. You saw what was happening. So we did the right thing. Everybody agrees to that.
Well, let's get more now. We can cross to Ashley Hayek, who is the Executive Vice President of the America First Policy Institute, who joins us from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. First up, how does the America First Policy Institute view this decision to deploy US Marines and National Guard troops to Los Angeles?
Well, this is the right decision because unfortunately in California, which is my home state, there is a lot of incompetent leadership, and it starts at the top with Governor Gavin Newsom. This is a man who's called for decriminalization of policies, who have allowed these criminals to take over the city of Los Angeles, who are allowing the people of California to be completely targeted by these criminal actions of these alleged so-called peaceful protesters, when we're seeing they are looting, they are attacking law enforcement officers, when the administration is trying to do their job. So President Trump has done the right thing by bringing in reinforcements. The funny thing is if you look back a couple years, Gavin Newsom had asked for the National Guard to come and support California. But now that President Trump is in office, he's backpedaling very quickly because he knows that this solution will work.
When it comes to Marines, I mean, people won't be used to seeing Marines on the streets of the United States. They're trained to use lethal force, not to provide domestic peacetime law enforcement. I mean, is their presence really justified there in California right now?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm married to a Marine, so I'm a little bit biased here. And the Marines do an incredible job bringing some sort of policing. And what's happening is the president's saying, look, if we don't get this under control, we'll bring in the Marines. And so just by taking that action, we're seeing that everything is starting to calm down. And so the strategy is working. I'm hoping that peace will be restored and that ultimately the people of California will have security and safety once again, when unfortunately Gavin Newsom was not able to provide that.
Clearly, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, very angered or very upset about this decision to send in the Marines and the National Guard, saying this is the act of a dictator, not a president. He said, this is a day I hoped I'd never see in America. The President of the United States has just as well called for the arrest of a sitting governor, because, of course, President Trump said he wouldn't rule out the idea of calling for his arrest. I mean, is he right to call for Governor Newsom's arrest, do you think?
Well, if you go back to the origination of that conversation, there was a journalist who had asked Tom Homan about whether or not people who were participating and are basically crossing that picket line would be arrested. And he said, yes, of course, if somebody is taking action against our law enforcement officers, then yes, there will be action. Even if that is Gavin Newsom, it doesn't matter who it is, you cannot attack a law enforcement officer. And so that's where that conversation was coming from. I love how the media likes to take that out of context and twist the president's words, but we're used to that. That's what we're used to seeing. Just like we've been told that it's a peaceful protest. Well, the American people have woken up. The left want to control people. We want freedom, stability, and peace. And so if Gavin Newsom cannot see that, then shame on him. He really shouldn't be governor. And the president was right. He's done a terrible job. His crime was running for governor. If you look at what's happened with the wildfires in California, if you look at what happened to the Palisades, if you look at the fact that California has been an illegal sanctuary city, meaning that criminals can roam freely, that they won't work with ICE to make sure that these criminals are off the streets and not victimizing legal citizens in California, that's a huge problem, and shame on Gavin Newsom.
And in terms of where we go to from here, what would to you look like a successful outcome when perhaps at which point, the troops can be stood down?
Well, hopefully the rioting will stop. The law enforcement can do their job. ICE can go and do their job and get the criminals off the streets, and that there can be a de-escalation by the left and an acknowledgement that this type of criminal activity, these riots should not be tolerated, and that there is unity amongst government, and that the federal government is able to do their job, and we can all work to protect the American people.
And what do you say to those in Los Angeles, particularly officials who say that things were calming down until the idea of deploying troops was put on the table, and that's made things worse and is going to make things even worse later on down the line? How would you counter that argument?
There's nothing that I could say to the Maxine Waters and the Gavin Newsoms that are going to allow them to concede the fact that there was cars lit on fire in their own backyard. These are the people that said that COVID was such a strict virus. They locked people down in their homes while they went to fancy restaurants and got their hair done. So I'm sorry, there's nothing that can be said to these failed leaders. What I would say to the California voters is you can do better, and you can have a better opportunity in your state if you elect people that put the American people, that put Californians first.
Is this political theatre, or is this policy necessity, or do you think, being purely objective, you'd say perhaps there's an element of both?
What's happening is this federal government is trying to remove illegal aliens who are criminals. And if you look at these criminals, they have murdered people, they have raped children, they are child molesters, they've been charged with domestic abuse. There's no political theater about this. They're trying to do a job to protect the American people. This is what the American people voted for. What's really surprising is another mainstream news source just released a poll that showed that immigrant families themselves have swung 40 points since 2020 in support of this type of policy. There's no political theater. This is what the American people want. It's a safe and secure community so people can live their lives in peace.
President Trump said if he hadn't sent in the troops, LA would have burnt to the ground. Do you think that's perhaps going a little far?
No, I think that's exactly right. And anybody who has two eyeballs and looks at those pictures and videos and sees cars lit on fire, law enforcement officers being attacked, thugs raiding stores, an Adidas store, for example. We saw what happened in Minnesota in 2020, where innocent, people's stores and livelihoods were burned to the ground. There's no doubt that this was the path that it was taking in Los Angeles as well. And President Trump, by all means, did exactly the right thing here.
What do you make of reports that the unrest is spreading to other parts of the United States? I mean, does that tally with what you're hearing where you are? And do you think this is running the risk of escalating and becoming a much broader concern in the United States?
Well, as we just talked about, when President Trump signaled for the Marines to come into LA, things started to calm down. I'm hoping that this is an example for other places where that they will have better control over the riots. We saw that the New York Police Department was able to take action yesterday outside of Trump Tower. And so I think that when you do have a state or communities that empower their law enforcement officers to do their jobs, unlike Los Angeles, unlike several places in California, then they'll be able to make sure that there maintains a level of peace. And hopefully the president won't need to do this, because so far up until this point, it's been pretty successful in terms of ICE being able to go in and implement the policies and do the jobs to keep our community safe. This is a very popular issue.
Sure. I mean, but there are a lot of people who will be fearful right now, not just in California, but in other parts of the United States. What would be your message?
They're absolutely fearful that we have allowed 20 million people into our country, many of them who have committed crimes against innocent American people. Look at Laken Riley, for example. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants to think that I could send my daughter off to college and she'll be brutalized and murdered by an illegal alien. Nobody wants their child to be replaced out of their public school to make room for other people who are not legally here. Nobody wants their Medicaid and their health care to be taken away because illegal alien criminals are taking those funds away from the American people and giving it to people who have not earned it, who are not here legally, and who are committing crimes against American people. That's what people are afraid of. That's why Donald J. Trump is president. They voted for these policies, and that's where I think a lot of people are getting very confused. This is about protecting American people and making them feel safe. They're not worried about a riot popping up. That can be squashed. We know that President Trump will get the backs of the American people. We know that when things get out of control, like they did in LA because Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass didn't do their job, President Trump will step in. What we don't know is that if states like California will continue to harbor illegal aliens, how many more innocent victims will there be?
Sure, but I didn't get to the end of the rest of my question, but I mean, for people who are obviously not criminals, which I think the majority of immigrants in the United States are, and statistically, well, perhaps you can correct me if I'm wrong, but statistically we're told that people born outside the United States are less likely to commit crimes than people born in the United States. But what would be your message to people who are perhaps fearful of being singled out wrongly, people who feel that their community is being stigmatized for things they haven't done?
If you heard what I just said a few minutes ago, there's a massive swing of immigrant people in the United States who support President Trump's border policies. It's up 8 points, which is a swing of 40 points of immigrant communities. That is not a very popular feeling. People who are here, who are legal immigrants, they want these policies. They voted for these policies because they work and because it makes safe communities. It's pretty simple.
Okay, just lastly, the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, who obviously opposes this clampdown, she says, this is a city of immigrants. How do you respond to the mayor?
We are a nation of immigrants. There's no doubt about that, of legal immigrants. And what we saw happen is complete protest when we had a federal agency try to do their job to remove illegal criminal aliens who I just said were child predators, domestic abusers, criminals that needed to be removed. I would like to know why Karen Bass cares more about protecting their rights than the rights of legal immigrant California citizens whose buildings are being burned down, whose businesses are being burned down. I'd like for her to go on record and answer that question.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Ashley Hayek, Executive Vice President of the America First Policy Institute. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Meanwhile, the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, is calling for calm. And she says there was no need for President Trump to send in the National Guard.
My conversations with the administration was before the deployment of the National Guard. I was trying to make the case that the National Guard was not needed here. I was trying to make the case that if the National Guard came here, it would be a provocative move, and it would be like a deliberate attempt to create disorder and chaos in our city. It was very predictable what was going to happen here, and it was completely unnecessary. I am hopeful that the federal government will hear our plea, stop the raids. This is creating fear and chaos in our city, and it is unnecessary.
Okay, well, let's cross now to Jose Barrera, who is the National Vice President of the League of United Latin American Citizens, who joins us from Los Angeles. Jose, thank you very much indeed for joining us. A fourth day of chaotic protests against these immigration raids. Are things showing any signs of dying down there?
First of all, thank you for the invitation and good morning from Los Angeles. No, I would not say that there's any signs of this dying down. I believe tensions are escalating and we are seeing more military personnel and more federal agents being deployed into Los Angeles, which is only creating more tensions with the community. And I want to make sure we are clear. There was no need for escalation and extra military personnel to come into Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Police Department, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department are all well equipped to keep the calm and the peace in Los Angeles County.
Okay, so you'd concur with what the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, just said there. And, you know, as we've been saying, local law enforcement officials saying the majority of the protests are peaceful. There are some isolated acts of violence, and yet Washington says there's citywide civil unrest. So just for the record, which one is it?
Well, you have to understand the demographics of Los Angeles. It's a widely immigrant community, and it's a melting pot of so many nations. Los Angeles County has 10 million people, and when you see vast protests that are majoritarily peaceful, and then you have one or two agitators, the media is only going to focus on the few agitators who are throwing rocks and bricks. But that does not compare to the equipment that the military is using to hold back these agitators. So is not a comparison. If we could isolate these incidents that we're seeing on the media, the rocks being thrown, or anything that's being launched at military personnel, it is within one or two blocks, while these protests that we're seeing are majority peaceful, with tens of hundreds, if not thousands of people who are out there peacefully protesting in opposition to these raids that are happening currently.
How would you describe the mood in Latin American communities there in Los Angeles right now?
Well, the community is very unified here. California, it is a heavily populated immigrant community. And so in Los Angeles, you have to understand that everybody knows an immigrant, whether it be a friend, a family, a coworker. We all know and love an immigrant. And to come in and have these raids happening only agitates the community, and the community will stand up. They are showing it in opposition to what's going on right now in these raids, and they're coming out peacefully.
Okay, and I mean, the protests, we understand, began peacefully enough. How do you interpret the shift from peaceful protests to confrontation and violence? Who's to blame? Where would you lay the blame?
Well, yes, the protests have started peacefully, and they have maintained peacefully for the majority of the part. Those isolated incidents have only occurred when the U.S. government has deployed extra ICE agents and have deployed the federal guard. And now we're looking at the Marines coming into this. That is escalating tensions. And those individuals who are agitating, they're not protesters, they're agitators. And, you know, one might believe that these are done intentionally to create extra tensions. And that is playing directly into the blueprint and playbook that we presume President Trump is trying to do, is to agitate the community so they could deploy more troops and show a hand in a political force against the governor and against the mayor of Los Angeles.
Yeah, we heard President Trump, before we crossed to you, saying words to the effect that if he hadn't deployed the Marines, LA would have burnt to the ground. What do you make of that?
Absolutely not. The Los Angeles Police Department and the Sheriff's Department, if we combine forces, there's over 17,000 law enforcement personnel locally who are all well equipped and trained to maintain the peace.
Tell me a bit about your organization, known by its acronym LULAC, which, just for the benefit of our viewers, stands for the League of United Latin American Citizens. How are you supporting, for example, the families who are involved in or impacted by these raids and deportations? Are you involved? And what is your role?
Yes, LULAC is the largest and oldest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. We're across the country, and we have a huge advocacy platform, especially in our capital, Washington, D.C., where we talk to elected officials. We're focused heavily on the advocacy side of things. We have shown up to some of these rallies and having conversations with people. And we believe in peaceful protests and engaging with the community and keeping them informed of their rights and the due processes.
Okay, well, thanks for that. We're going to wrap up, but I just want to ask you before we do, just going back to what the officials are saying. We've got the head of ICE suggesting that perhaps Governor Newsom be arrested. President Trump seems to be endorsing that. What's your feeling? On the one hand, how's Governor Newsom handling this, and how's President Trump handling this?
Well, I think this is a political attack on the governor. Governor Newsom is doing an excellent job. I don't think that there was any need to increase tensions in Los Angeles. You know, from what we're seeing here, and I was in downtown LA yesterday morning, and there was no tensions. There was nothing really going on. It was just as business as usual. And then you have these rallies that are maintained peacefully. So we haven't seen anything out of the ordinary, and understanding that Los Angeles is a massive city. Wherever we see one of these incidents, it's probably within just 1 or 2 blocks with almost no people. So I don't see the need for extra military force.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Jose Barrera. Thank you for your time today.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, let's get more now. We can speak to Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas. He joins us from London. Greg, great to have you with us as ever on Al Arabiya English. Let's turn our attention immediately to what's happening in Los Angeles. The city mayor, Karen Bass, says the deployment of troops is, quote, a deliberate attempt by the Trump administration to create disorder and chaos in our city. Those are her words. What do you think President Trump is trying to achieve here?
Well, I think Karen Bass is in a bit of a pinch. She's in, maybe committed political suicide here. I mean, it was bad enough with the wildfires late last year, but she's she's got a real problem on her hands because she's failed to act. Now, that's her comment there was completely contrary to the comments from the LA Police Commissioner McDonnell, who voiced much more concern and said on the first night of rioting he was really worried about escalation and worried about the safety of his officers. So what President Trump wants to accomplish is a few things. One is protecting the citizens of California and of the United States. 2 is protecting federal property and also federal law enforcement, not federal, but any law enforcement personnel, but especially the ICE officers, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers that are on the ground in LA. So, he's trying to accomplish a few things, but starting with the safety and security of his citizens.
So it sounds like you think that authorizing this level of military intervention was in fact justified.
Absolutely it was. And look, it looks, at least so far, Tom, that it's working, because there was not, after a couple of nights of escalation, it's actually been dialed down a bit. Swift, disciplined response prevented further escalation, and that's the plan. And remember, there's some context here. President Trump did not send any federal assets into the cities, especially Minneapolis, during the George Floyd riots in 2020. I think that was, in retrospect, a mistake. There was some pressure from a few senators like Tom Cotton, and he chose not to do it. He wasn't really getting the support at the time. It was during COVID. He was probably polling in the low 40s. So this time around, I don't think he's going to make that same mistake twice.
Why wouldn't the governor of California make that request himself if it was the right thing to do? Why do you think he didn't call for the military to come in?
Yeah, I think for a few reasons. One is Governor Newsom rarely does the right thing. So, it really doesn't surprise anybody. He failed in so many ways on the fires, the wildfires. He's done his best to ruin that state. There's a reason why California leads the nation in mass out-migration. I mean, people are leaving California in droves because it's becoming unlivable in many ways, and especially with the tax and regulatory burden, but also the homelessness and all the other problems with the state. So, I think he always chooses the more progressive, left-wing, radical solution to any problem, or he just ignores it. So I think in this case, much like homelessness, much like the mass exodus from his state, he's chosen to ignore it. Remember, the progressive left, Tom, is pro-illegal migration. So in this case, that was probably an easy call for Governor Newsom.
Yeah, I mean, Newsom's come out with quite a lot of strong statements, saying this reflects, quote, the deranged fantasy of a dictatorial president, calling President Trump authoritarian, un-American. I mean, he says as well this sets a dangerous precedent, having uninvited troops appearing in his state. And he seems to be arguing, a bit like, as I said at the beginning, the mayor of Los Angeles, that in fact their presence is doing more harm than good. Just before we move on, how do you answer that?
Yeah, absolutely wrong. Because when he was talking about it, he gave them time to actually handle it themselves. They did not. He sent in troops. There weren't actually that many involved in quelling the rioting. I think it was just the presence of them, even nearby, even if they weren't at the site. Now, there were some National Guards guarding the federal property, but it was really ultimately the presence of the troops there that enabled the LAPD to more effectively manage it. But the protesters have just moved away. They'll find some other issue to protest about. They'll go to a Free Palestine march somewhere else.
There are reports of protests spreading to other parts of the United States. Yeah. I mean, are you worried about a sort of a widespread outbreak of unrest in the United States right now?
Yeah, of course I am, because we saw this not only in 2020, in the summer of 2020, but we saw it early in President Trump's first term, where there was the so-called resistance. There were protests all over the country. Look, if they're peaceful protests, that's fine. I think they have the right to do that. I think also, if they don't like current immigration law, they should lobby their congressman to change the law. But as long as they don't change the law, the president and the executive branch has an obligation under Article 2 and statute to actually execute or enforce the law. Obama did it. President Obama might not have liked the immigration laws, but he was obligated to enforce them, and he did. And his justice people like Cecilia Munoz came out and argued for it and said, this is our obligation. So President Biden chose not to enforce the law, and President Trump has chosen to enforce the law. It's a pretty simple formula.
President Trump is one of the people who's calling for, well, he's supporting a call for Governor Newsom's arrest. I mean, has he done anything that warrants arrest, in your opinion?
I mean, it might be a bit much. He has, in a sense, broken the law by not enforcing federal immigration law and actually assisting the criminals in avoiding arrest and avoiding prosecution. So in theory, Tom, he has broken the law. He's assisted criminals to avoid law enforcement, and that's against the law. So, if you wanted to get down to, real details and the letter of the law, yeah, okay, you could probably make that argument. I'm not sure that it's constructive to do that, but something has to change. And as these blue state sanctuary cities and sanctuary states continue to foil the progress and the efforts of the federal level, the federal level enforcement officers, that's really not good. And we've seen this in the past in American history, starting with the Civil War, but also with John F. Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower sending federal troops to southern states, to southern segregationist states, to desegregate the schools. I mean, this happened all the time. He sent 30,000 troops and federalized the Alabama National Guard in order to liberate these poor kids who weren't allowed to go to schools because they were African American. So there's a real solid history and precedent of presidents sending federal troops if those governors choose not to enforce the law. And that's exactly what Newsom has done here.
I mean, for people who don't know the United States particularly well, I mean, is California by far and away the most serious case when it comes to illegal immigration, or are there lots of other states that are comparable?
Yeah, there's lots of other states. I don't know that statistic specifically, Tom, but I think they would be number one. partly because they're a border state, but of the border states, they're clearly the most progressive and liberal, and parts of LA are just overwhelmed with illegal migrants now. So, yes, there's a problem in Chicago, New York, many other cities, but it's probably, I would have to argue, agree with you, California is most likely the worst.
Some cynics saying President Trump is merely trying to sort of energize his base here and stir up a lot of excitement. I mean, is there any weight to those claims, do you think?
I don't think so. Look, he's demonstrated leadership here. I think the Democrats, especially in California, have committed political malpractice. I mean, this is another issue where they're dying on the hill of an 80-20 problem. I mean, who would want those people in those neighborhoods suffering because of these riots, because of looting, because of burning cars? It's not happening in Beverly Hills or Bel Air or even the nice neighborhoods of San Francisco. This is happening in working class neighborhoods. People are on hourly wages, and they're actual immigrant communities that are being wrecked because of the state and the city's decision not to enforce, not only to not enforce, immigration law, but also to not stop these protests before they get violent or at the beginning of the violence. And so, I mean, this is unfortunate. I'm sure the president doesn't welcome this, but he had to take responsibility, and he's obligated under the Constitution to do so.
Gavin Newsom has been the governor of California for more than 5 years. President Trump, I can quote him here as saying, his primary crime is running for governor. He's done such a bad job. What he's done to the state is like what Biden did to this country. I mean, if he's such a bad governor, why has he been there for such a long time?
Yeah, great question, Tom. And I think it's because the state has really moved to the progressive left over the last generation or so. And more importantly, they are owned by the public employee unions. So once that cycle starts, that sort of spiral where the unions support the progressive Democrats, and then when the Democrats get in office, they look after the unions with very, very lucrative contracts and retirement plans. Unsustainable. So then they have to raise taxes on the poor people that stay. It's just a kind of a tax public union spiral. And that's why he keeps getting elected. I mean, look at that state. We have, Kamala Harris. We have, Karen Bass, the mayor. You have, Schiff, the senator, former congressman, now Senator Schiff, Adam Schiff. I mean, these are the most radical, for the most part, the most radical and left-leaning politicians in the country. It's too bad because California used to be a red state. And remember when George H.W. Bush sent federal troops, both not only National Guard, but Army and Marines. So he sent 3 branches to L.A. during the Rodney King riots in 1992. That he was welcomed. They were welcomed by the governor, who was a Republican at the time. It seems like a long time ago, and it was over 30 years ago. But right now, it would have been so much more productive if Governor Newsom either did his job and enforced federal law, or at least welcomed the support of President Trump sending the National Guard and some Marines. Unfortunately, it's not that way. But in the past, again, with JFK and Eisenhower, they sent troops to stop the governors from their insurrection.
Okay, so just to sort of wrap up, there are those who say this is political theatre. Others are saying this is policy necessity. Is there an element of both, or would you say this is purely about what absolutely has to be done?
I think there's political theater in just about everything in American politics, maybe politics in general. But I do think it's the latter. I mean, the president, if he had overseen another 2020, summer of 2020 riot situation where Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, and especially Minneapolis, while the governor, Tim Walz, basically watched and waited while Minneapolis burned. I just don't think the president would want that to happen again. So he's learned by experience, but also by history, that the best thing you could do is stop it before it gets too out of hand. And I think he's done a good job of that. So I think the president comes out looking good on this. Right now, his polls are overall are -2.5. But on this issue, on immigration, he's at plus 4.5. That's a 7-point difference. And I think in a 50-50 country, that's significant. So on this issue, it's a winner for President Trump. And thank goodness that the violence has been dialed down and it's been de-escalated. So I think there's always a risk that it backfires, but in this case, it did not.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you. Greg
Thanks,
Swenson,
Tom.
Chair of Republican
Great to see
Services.
you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, turning our attention to the situation in Gaza, where the local health authorities say that Israeli gunfire has killed at least 17 Palestinians today and wounded dozens of others. This happened in central Gaza as thousands of displaced people approached an aid distribution site. Well, the Israeli military, which disputes the death toll, says it fired warning shots. Well, separately, local health authorities say that an Israeli strike on a house in Deir al-Balah, also in central Gaza, killed 8 people, meaning that today's death toll in the enclave stands at least 25. Well, since Israel's military campaign began, 54,981 people are reported to have been killed. Meanwhile, the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg has now been deported from Israel and has arrived in Paris earlier on today. She was part of a self-styled Freedom Flotilla coalition, which was headed to Gaza. Well, Thunberg accuses Israel of kidnapping her and her fellow activists in international waters. Let's get more now. We can speak to Dr. Victoria Rose, who is a British doctor who is just back from her 3rd humanitarian mission to Gaza. Dr. Rose, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Pleasure.
You are a consultant in plastic and reconstructive surgery, and I gather you worked, non-stop more or less the time you were in Gaza. Just talk us through what your day-to-day reality was when you were there.
Well, we would start operating at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and we would have a list downstairs in one of the big NGO-run buildings. We would run a plastic surgery list and next to it an orthopedic list. And the idea was that we would cross-cover any orthopedic injuries that had skin loss or skin issues. We would do those as well, and then we would have our own list. We'd have about 10 patients on the plastics list, 10 patients on the orthopedic list, and then we would run a sedation room of dressing changes, and that would have another 5 patients on it. At the same time, we'd have to be available to the main theatre suite, which was upstairs, and it was a block of 5 theatres, and that's where general surgery, neurosurgery, vascular surgery would undertake their work. And if they came across any patients that had large areas of soft tissue loss or burns or needed amputations, then they would call us and we would go up and help them with those cases as well. So it's a really quite a busy day. We're operating on sort of, up to 25 patients a day. And we would normally try and finish all the planned work by about 10 o'clock at night. And then we would go back to the accommodation area, which was within the hospital. We would normally eat. We would sort of discuss the plans for the next day. I would put in the following day's operating list, and then we would submit all our numbers of our activity for the day to the WHO and then go to bed. We would be called in the night for any mass casualty events that required urgent plastic surgery. So that would normally be limb-threatening injuries. That tended to happen more towards the end of our trip because we started to see more mass casualties then as NASA got further into the active fighting zone.
And how long did you maintain that routine for?
Every day for just over 3 weeks.
Okay, and did you feel, you mentioned mass casualty events happening in the vicinity. Did you feel at any stage that your life was in danger?
Yes, I was worried the first day we arrived because we were due to go to the European Gaza hospital. So when we entered Gaza, that was where our vehicle was taking us. our charity had two groups go in. So I was a group with 3 surgeons, and the week before me, a group of 2 surgeons had gone in. One that I know very well, he's an old friend, and they had gone straight to the European Gaza. And as we arrived, the European Gaza got bombed. And so he was sending me footage of an explosion outside the hospital. And at that point, I was quite worried for his life, really, and the life of my other colleague. But I did sort of worry that hospital bombing was getting more and more acceptable, I suppose, and that we would be in danger.
You've described your daily reality. Now tell us what the daily reality for the average person in Gaza is, as far as you were able to see from where you were.
So obviously I'm mixing mainly with Palestinian doctors and nurses. They've all been displaced, many of them up to sort of 15 times now. Lots of them are living in tents. There's not many structural buildings left in South Gaza. There's no sanitation in any of these sort of tented facilities. There's very little clean water left. Clean water now is only available in areas like large hospitals that have their own filtration systems. Most of the other buildings have been destroyed. So clean water is one of the things that people worry about. And a lot of people spend their time trying to obtain clean water and food. Obviously, the blockade to aid was fairly maximal when we got there. Nothing had come in since the 2nd of March. And although we were in Gaza when the first 90 trucks got in, it didn't really seem as if much aid had come through. Everybody was still spending a lot of their time sourcing food. The level of malnutrition was visible in the population. I mean, it's a dire life, really. When I spoke to my colleagues this time, more than one said that they would rather die than carry on living like this.
And you said malnutrition was visible. Could you just try to help us understand? Because we're told sometimes by the authorities in Israel that reports of malnutrition, reports of starvation are wildly exaggerated. Help us make sense of this. What did you see? I mean, what's the evidence, and what would be some of the definitions you could use to help us to really get a true picture of the situation?
Well, everybody that I'd met before, because obviously I've been to Gaza before the war, everybody I knew that came to see us or that we were working with has lost weight, and it's very visible weight loss, so 5-10 kilos. But we noticed it really in the children. The children are hit the hardest because the under 5s particularly have a very high metabolic rate because they're growing. And what I noticed most was that the children are very small for their age in comparison to their Western counterparts. So a child that would go on the operating table, I would estimate to be 5 years old. I would be told that they were 9 or 10. And that was quite shocking. They're very small. There's definite fat loss and muscle wasting to see in the children. The other thing that we noticed is their immune system's definitely been suppressed. And that's one of the first things to go in malnutrition. You just don't have that cell turnover to fight off infection or repair, really. You need those essential nutrients and vitamins for cell restoration. And we saw a lot of children that would have stabilized or made some sign of recovery when we were in Gaza in March, but this time you were cleaning, debriding and dressing wounds, and then when you brought them back to do the reconstruction, there was signs of infection, more dead tissue, nothing was recovering. And that's quite hard to deal with because we also had a lack of antibiotics. We only had 3 types of antibiotics left. We had meropenem, gentamicin and a cephalosporin, and those 3 are not really first-line antibiotics for dirty wounds like this, we would normally in the UK use a broad spectrum penicillin, but we'd run out of that. So coupled with that depressed level of healing and immunity, you've got no pharmaceutical aids to help the situation. So we saw a lot of children who possibly would have had treatable or more salvageable injuries, and we couldn't really do much other than amputate.
We're also told, in addition to what sounds like an acute shortage of antibiotics, that operations are sometimes having to be conducted without correct anesthesia, without the right tools. Were you allowed to bring anything with you? Because I'm sure you had to pass by Israel in order to get there. Were you allowed to bring supplies, knowing as you did from having worked there on the ground, what sorts of medications, what sorts of tools might be most in need?
Well, the charity doesn't have a license to carry medicines, so we've never attempted to get medicines in. The rules from COGAT, who are the Coordination of Activities in the Occupied Palestinian Territories, are that the emergency medical teams can only bring one bag with them, and that bag can't be more than 23 kilograms. And it's suggested that you don't bring any kit in that bag. You're limited to the number of mobile phones, computers, cigarettes, any of those items that could be sold. You're not to bring in multiples, but they do ask you not to bring in kit as well. However, I've never had any kit taken off of me. I've not bought in huge quantities, but this time I bought a skin grafting set, and I bought some instruments. I bought probably 2 full sets of scissors and forceps, because I knew that NASA didn't have them, or we knew that the European Gaza didn't have them, which was where we were supposed to go, but NASA didn't have them either. And they were distributed amongst mine and my colleagues' belongings in a way that looked as if they weren't huge quantities. But none of our bags got opened. Well, if they got opened, nothing got taken. So we did get quite a lot in, but there is always that fear that you won't. And there are stories that people have had things taken off them, but that certainly didn't happen to us.
Is there one image or one scene from your time in Gaza? You say you were there around 3 weeks, that you're just never going to be able to erase from your mind, whether it's from this latest trip or one of the previous trips? Or perhaps there was one encounter with one individual that perhaps struck you more than all the others?
There's been lots, really, to be honest, but it's the children more than anything. And it's normally the children with life-changing injuries who you then find out have lost all of their relatives, so they've been orphaned as well. I think one of the hardest things for me was a 7-year-old girl that came in, had been blown up, and she had lost a section of her knee. So she'd lost the bone from her knee to her shin, and that was missing, as was all the skin overlying it. And the muscles that should have been there were gone. And when she was brought in, when you lose something like that in the UK, if you amputate a bit of you, when you're brought into hospital, they always bring the part with you, and there's an attempt to replant that part. And this was quite offsetting, that she'd come in and that part of her body was completely missing. And anatomically, it's very odd to look at a wound like that. And she was one of the patients that was definitely suffering from malnutrition. And when we did the first operation to clean her leg and dress it, I was fairly confident that we'd made some ground, and that when we got her back, we would be able to reconstruct her. But by the time we got her back 48 hours later, and the wound was infected and there was more dead tissue in, and she had to undergo another debridement, so removal of that dead infected tissue. And by the 4th time we brought her back to the operating room, it was clear that we were going to have to amputate her leg, and that we were going to have to amputate her leg above the knee. And I think that was quite hard, because the initial injury, we had such a good plan to reconstruct her, but she just wasn't healing. She succumbed to infection. it was just impossible to carry out the initial plan. And for a 7-year-old to have an above knee amputation is just devastational, really. I mean, the word life-changing doesn't cover it. And she'd been orphaned in the blast as well.
A horrific story there. I mean, I assume you follow, now that you're back in the UK, what's happening in Gaza, and perhaps you avoid them, but when you watch news channels, what bothers you most about what you know to be the reality on the ground and how it's covered and how it's portrayed by the media and by officials on either side?
I think it's very difficult, and I have to sort of concentrate on the humanitarian side of it. I mean, I'm not playing down what happened on October the 7th, and, you know, a lot of women and children were taken hostage in that event. But the collateral damage from this attack on Hamas is quite shocking. The number of children that are being injured and cited as, you know, we're not attacking children, we're after a terrorist organization. But it's a vast number of children that have been maimed, killed, orphaned, really huge numbers. And every time I've been, the number of children affected is rising. This time, you know, 60% of my operating list every day was under the age of 15. And I'm operating on, you know, 13 people every day. So it just gives you an example of what I'm seeing. And it's very difficult to fully accept that it's a targeted attack on Hamas terrorists.
And when you compare coverage of Gaza to, say, coverage of Ukraine, where there's tragedy every day and children, women, men maimed every day, do you get the impression there's a bit of a double standard when it comes to covering suffering according to who's actually the one suffering? Do you detect that?
I think what's the hardest is to work out what news is fake and what is not, because I think whatever comes out seems to be cited as fake. And I know a lot of the Western media say that they can't get in and they can't, you know, verify what's coming out of Gaza, but there are quite a few Palestinian photographers and filmmakers that are putting their footage out, but it is constantly being disbelieved and cited as fake. Just as in, you know, a lot of the comments that Israel make are being, you know, lots of the comments about the initial October the 7th were cited as fake. And I just think we've got a very muddy picture of what's going on. And all I can say is what I saw. And I saw a lot of young children with very devastating wounds.
Okay, and Dr. Rose, I mean, given that there is a discrepancy, it would appear, between what you saw and what we as a news channel and other news channels get told, for example, by the Israeli government. Let me put some quick statements to you, and I'd like to get your reaction to them, and you can tell me in a couple of words whether or not those statements hold any water. So one thing we're repeatedly told is that hospitals are hotbeds for Hamas. They're used as command centers by militants. Did you see any evidence to support that?
Not this time. Not any time I've been there. I mean, I've been to the European Gaza and Nasser twice, and over the course of 2024 and into 2025, I haven't seen any Hamas soldiers in those hospitals when I've been there. I haven't actually seen anyone in military uniform or anyone carrying a gun, but I don't know what Hamas looks like, I suppose, would be the answer to that. And maybe they were there and I didn't see them, but I didn't see anyone militarized.
All right, we're told hospitals are used as a cover for a labyrinth of tunnels used by militants. Did you see any tunnels, or were there any areas of the hospital people said, oh, I wouldn't go there if I were you?
No, I didn't see any tunnels, but then I have seen footage of tunnels. So all I can say is what I saw. I didn't see any tunnels at Nasa, and in the march, I didn't see any tunnels at the European Gaza. But I spend most of my time in the operating theatre or walking between the accommodation and the operating theatre. I was quite surprised by the footage from the European Gaza to see that there were tunnels under the front entrance, particularly because I walked across that every day, and that was completely unnoticed by me.
Okay, we're told that the majority of the 54,927 people killed, which is the latest local official death toll, although that might be disputed by Israel, we're told the majority were Hamas militants. Does that sort of ring true to you?
Well, as I said, I think half of them are children. At least half of them are children. So unless they're recruiting children, I would say I can't follow that statistic, really. Half of the people I treated were children, so I can't follow that statistic.
Okay, and we're told repeatedly no one is dying of starvation. The reports of malnutrition are wildly exaggerated. People have enough to eat. How would you respond to that?
I don't think that's true. Certainly not from what we saw on this mission. Nobody's got enough to eat, and there were definitely signs of malnutrition. 60 children died at NASA from malnutrition while we were there. Admittedly, a lot of those are children that are gluten intolerant and can't take standard formula milk, or children with other metabolic illnesses that they can't treat because of the lack of supplies. But there's definitely signs of malnutrition at NASA at the moment, and for the entirety of the month we were there.
I know you're a doctor, you're not a political figure, so please feel free to disregard this next question. But does the word genocide ring true to you as being a word that could be apt to describe the situation in Gaza right now?
I thought so, but I understand that the definition possibly isn't what I think it is. So it's probably not for me to be drawn in it. But there's a huge number of people dying in Gaza at the moment that needlessly as collateral damage for this war. And I'm not sure how long we can watch that happen from a humanitarian point of view.
And were you to get 30 seconds with the British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, what message would you want to get across to him?
I think this is becoming very partisan now. I think we have to be very careful of the way that we go forward. I think that this is not going to end well if it continues. I'm concerned about the number of children that have been orphaned, and the videos that I've seen of small children, who've lost a parent, screaming and ranting at the camera. I worry what those children will grow up into. There is definitely a rise in anti-Semitic behaviour, particularly in the USA. I don't think we can just let this carry on the way that this war is being run. It's not going to end well for anyone, and I would urge my government to look very carefully at measures that they can immediately take to bring a stop to it.
Just talking about you as we wrap up, how does it feel to be back, and how are you processing everything you've seen and reconciling that with your vastly different daily reality now that you're back in the UK?
I'm sort of still in it, really, because I'm still in conversation with my colleagues in Gaza. We still have patients that we've operated on that I'm being updated on. I'm still watching NASA in the red zone. I said tomorrow I will watch the MSF NGO evacuate NASA, which is possibly the beginning of the end for it. So I don't feel that I'm in a position to step out and process it. I think if this war, if we do get a ceasefire, what I've seen might possibly be worth it, and I'll feel that we've accomplished something. But as I say, I'm concerned about the future for both sides if we don't stop.
Just in a word, would you go back?
I would love to go back. I'd quite like to go back when it's all over, just to see people that we've been working with, and not necessarily work the way in which I've been working. I would like to go back, but at the moment, I don't think I will be allowed back in. I don't think I will get permission to enter Gaza again, and until the situation changes.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. We really appreciate it. Dr. Victoria Rose, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.